So, the Roland System 700. In this video, I will show you close-up view scans of a Roland System 700 brochure from the late 1970s. Now, the Roland 700 was a mammoth modular system. If you've never heard of it, well, it's not surprising because only a handful were made. The consensus seems to be around 40 units, although some sources suggest as many as 70 were made. So not a mass-produced item, and over time the number of working units have obviously dwindled. So this was a mammoth modular system designed to compete with the Moog modular systems and the ARP 2600. And I was actually fortunate enough sometime around 1980, I suspect, to actually play the keys on one of these systems. And I'll tell you how that came about if you will indulge me for a minute or two. Back then there were no computers, there was no internet. The only way to get information about synthesizers and synthesis was to go along to your local music shop. If you wanted to learn about synthesis, you had to rely on books and magazine articles. And I read every book and every magazine article that I could find on the subject through the 70s and the 80s. And one series of articles, I think it was published in a magazine called International Musician, I could be wrong, but it was a series about the synthesizer, and I'm sorry, but I really can't remember who actually wrote it. But I wrote him a letter, as you did, because we didn't have email at the time, and we exchanged a few letters, and he said he had a System 700, would I like to see it? And he lived just over an hour away. So I thought, yes, I certainly would. I went down to see him and he showed me into his front room, and one of the walls was filled with all the cabinets from the System 700, and it was an absolutely amazing sight. And he let me touch it and play the keys, although at the time I had no experience of modular systems, so I couldn't really do anything practical with it. But it was through him, I have to say, that I got the Roland 100M system. I definitely couldn't afford a System 700. The Roland 100M system was a little bit more affordable. I can't remember exactly how much I paid for it. I think probably around £1,500, which was probably the best part of a year's wages back in 1980. So I was rummaging through the archives and came across this brochure, and I thought you might like to have a look and see what was in it. So this is a brochure for the Roland System 700. The system was released in 1976. This brochure is actually from 1978. You can see on the first page it contains, or it shows, all the blocks or cabinets of the system. The brochure itself is essentially 3 pieces of A4 stuck together. And if we open it up, we can see that the next 2 pages, they sort of run together. The first one contains information on the master or the central control module and the keyboard, and there's a lot of information about this on the in the brochure. And if we fold the edge up, you can see that it sort of cuts the keyboard in half, but we'll look at that in a second. And if we flip it over, you can see that on the left hand side there are 2 optional cabinets or modules. The sequencer, the wonderful sequencer, is in the middle, and there are a further 2 optional cabinets or modules, or blocks as the brochure calls them, on the right hand side. So let's look at these now. So this is the first page of the brochure. I have blown it up as much as I can, so if you want to read all the text, then hopefully if you pause the video you should be able to read it. Now the first page, as you saw on the initial shot of the brochure, contains all the modules in the system. Now this is actually a pretty good scan, but the images certainly do not do the system any justice. But this is how they appear on the brochure itself. So I have left links to a couple of videos in the description where you can see the System 700 in all its beautiful hardware technological glory. you can see from the design that this was a feature, or the features of the System 700 were carried forward to other Roland synthesizers, including of course the System 100M. So here is the main console. It was quite likely that if you were to find a System 700, or we'll say a minimal System 700, then it would contain the main console here and the keyboard. This is a 5-octave keyboard. So these were probably the two most common modules that you would find. This is the sequencer module, and on the side are two optional modules. We get into these in a little bit more detail later on in the brochure. Now, the interesting thing is that some parts of the system were actually normalized and hardwired, a little bit like the original Moog systems. Another interesting fact is that you could actually specify which modules you wanted in these optional modules. I think you could also do that in the master console as well, certainly to some degree. As it stands, I think it had 3 VCOs, 2 filters, a couple of ADSRs, a couple of LFOs, reverb and phase effects. You can read exactly what it had in the text above. So this was a bit of a beast of a synth, certainly for the time, and also very flexible. This is just a little bit of text at the bottom of the brochure. Okay, let's have a look at the next page. So this is the master console, and even if the detail is not particularly good, you can sort of see the outline of the various modules, the oscillators, the filters, and so on. I'm not going to dwell too long on this because it is really not doing the system any favors, but this is what the brochure was like. So if we scroll down, you can see there's a little bit of information about the master console and a little bit of information about the keyboard, which has been cut off and is continued on the next page. And here is the next page, and most of this is concerned with information about the master console. So again, if you want to read this, you can pause the video and hopefully you will be able to read the text. Move that up a bit. So this is information on all the modules in the master console, and that is the rest of the keyboard. The keyboard, by the way, was duophonic. It could play 2 notes, which I think was quite a, maybe not totally revolutionary, but it was a really nice feature to have, certainly back in the late 70s. Now we come on to what the brochure calls the optional modules. This is block 4, essentially a whole load of VCOs and other bits and pieces, which you can see here and read about there. And this is another cabinet. This is block 5, a collection of filters and VCAs. Very nice optional modules to add to the system. And here's the next page. This is one of my favorite modules, the sequencer. It was a 3-channel 12-step sequencer with lots of additional features. I love step sequencers, and back in the 80s, when I had the Roland 100M system, I would have died for a sequencer like this. And here's the information about it. And if you like step sequencers like me, you will probably drool over this as well. One thing about the sequencers, step sequencers of the day, and this includes the Roland obviously and the Moog, they tended not to have quantizers, and I think it was certainly now this is a crime against synthesizers, a crime against sequencers. I think it should be a law that every step sequencer should at least have the option of a quantize function. But still, if you imagine the artists of the day had to tune each of the steps by hand, so no mean feat. And here we are at the last page, and this is another one of the optional units, block number 6. It was an interface and a mixer, and you can read about it here, and if we move down, this is the final optional unit, block 7, a phase shifter and audio delay unit, or at least modules. And as I said, if you wanted more or less of any modules, then you could customize the cabinets. They were, as the system brochure does explain, I think, interchangeable. See, although there were 4 optional cabinets, you could essentially put any module into those that you like. But looking at the system as a whole, I think Roland made a pretty good choice putting the modules into the cabinets that they did. Yes, I certainly would have died for one of these back in the early 80s. And finally, you can see just at the bottom here, this was published in Japan, May 78. Well, I hope you enjoyed that and found it interesting. I have to say, I can't find any definitive information about how much the modules or the blocks of the cabinets cost back then. I can tell you that today they will go for an astronomical sum. If you Google the System 700, you will find old adverts for it, some on Reverb. Some were asking around £13,000 for the main console and the keyboard. There's also a listing for, I think it was a full system from a UK company which was selling one several years ago for £70,000. I suspect it has been sold. I would not be at all surprised if a complete system now was to sell for over 100 grand. Such is the price of Rarity. So if you look at the system, particularly in some of the videos which I've linked to in the description, you might think how desirable it is, and I could not disagree at all. However, there are fortunately many cheaper options available today in Eurorack and in 5U systems. Anyway, that's it for this video. I really hope you enjoyed this blast from the past, the Roland System 700. If you did enjoy it, I have a few more videos of vintage instrument brochures on this channel, which I shall link to in the description, and see if I can pop a card to them up there. And if you did enjoy it and are interested in synthesizers and synthy stuff and sounds and electronic music, then maybe you would like to consider subscribing to the channel, because that's what it's all about. If you ring the bell, thank you, you will get informed of new videos whenever I release them. As always, I really do appreciate you spending time watching my videos, so for that, thank you very much indeed. I will see you again very soon.